I just got an email the other day that said, my son, little Johnny, needs a new car. He just turned 16 and he got his learner's permit. I'm like, look, the 458 Italia is the perfect car for him. With prices at $200,000, you can't afford not to buy one of these.
The Ferrari 458. It's long gone, been replaced by the 488 and now the F8. So why would you consider even looking at this? Well, it's the last generation naturally aspirated V8 from Ferrari. And when we get on the interior space, there's some good and bad. On the surface, everything looks very driver-centric, modern, well put together. That is, and at least until you get into the nitty-gritty and take a look at the fine print of that. Dashboards shrinking or things discoloring, the badges falling off, creaks, rattles, just quality issues adorn this cabin space. And at around $250,000 to $300,000 new, that's not particularly what you would expect, at least on my part. However, there's some concessions I can make for those types of defects. But let's talk about the ergonomics and overall feel of this cabin. Now, of course, like any exotic, you can spec these cars out the way that you want them in terms of leathers, Alcantara. Basically, every surface could be carbon fiber if you wanted, and you can jack the price up to probably $500,000. But this is tastefully done. It's mostly leather surfaces and carbon with some contrasting yellow stitching. Now, when you look at it and you sit here, the first thing you're going to notice is just how much room is on the interior of this. You can be a taller, wider person and sit in here in comfort. You don't feel like you're in a coffin. The steering wheel is large, but yet you are looking at a monstrous tachometer that revs out to 9,000 RPMs. It's so purpose-built and racy feeling, right down to the steering wheel controls. You have this carbon inlay with leather around it. You have a top part that you can see where you're revving to in terms of shift lights. You have your damper button and your turn signals are on the steering wheel, not on the column. One of the big pros or cons, depending how you are the shifters are column mounted. They do not rotate with the steering wheel, so if you wind up getting crossed over in a car like this might happen because it's more tail happy, you constantly have to change hand position. Now, everything else is very driver-centric, from the controls on the left and the right-hand side of the gauge cluster. The left side here controls the left screen, the right-hand side controls the infotainment on the right screen. Stupid simple. Your shift buttons down here basically are resorted to reverse and auto and manual, and then you have your launch control button. Your window switches are on the center. I mean, it is a very well laid out cabin for somebody that enjoys to drive. There are minimal distractions. Seats, legroom, all of that, again, great. You do have a cup holder here, which is probably, your cup's probably gonna eject out and splash all over your passenger. Overall, the interior quality is not the highest, but the layout and the way everything works is excellent. But let's head into the shop and talk about the mechanical attributes.
Oh boy, Mark, I brought you a 458 Italia from one of our viewers who's been crazy enough to lend us one of these cars. He bought this car from Ferrari Continental.
Oh, Continental. In Illinois. They
Yep.
sell a lot of Ferraris, don't they?
They do.
They're going to be selling one to me right after this. I got about $6 million burning a hole in my pocket.
Is it after you sold all of your internal organs?
I've sold pretty much everything for my past 27 generations of things, including my gold bullion. This, however, is not worth $6 million. It's got some miles on it for a Ferrari. about what, 19,000 miles?
Yep. That means because this car is an 11 and not CPO'd, it's probably in the low 100s. However, when you CPO one of these cars, because you can still buy one with a very long warranty, which you should do if you can afford this, is about $200,000. So they're still very expensive cars.
So let's get into it, Jack. The manufacturing process of this car, it's all aluminum. It is built in Maranello.
Yep.
And Maranello is a very interesting factory because it's kind of very green. They're trying to be very conservative and eco-friendly. There's plants and bushes.
Yeah, because the 9,000 RPM V8 is very...
But I think it's more for the workers. It's supposed to give it a very clean, like calm aesthetic, and the facilities are spotless.
Because that's what I associate with Italians.
Right, yeah, exactly. So when you see this thing go through the plant flow, it's a great mix of full automation, handmade quality, and a ton of electronic controls and electronic quality checks. So that's the culmination of this, and this is why Ferrari's been able to be so successful. Unlike some boutique brands that can spend weeks building one car in a race bay, this does get through the plant quickly. And in terms of a body structure, it looks much like the 488 that we saw because it really is almost the same as the 488. And you see a lot of plastic coverings, underbody coatings. Like this looks like a total normal car. And when you get to the front suspension, we've seen luxury cars that look more exotic than this.
If you've gotten under a more recent Porsche, even like a 991 Porsche, it looks more sophisticated than this car. This car actually looks, for its asking price of $225,000 or more when it was new, actually pretty cheap underneath, surprisingly.
Yeah, and cheap is relative. Again, they're trying to get this thing in and out. They've minimized their costs.
And bake in margin as well.
Yes, and so Ferrari in this era did not do any advertising. They did not do any serious marketing. Their marketing was their $1 billion F1 team. That's what sells Ferraris, and whatever they make on these, with all the margin, helps to pay for the driver's salary, a 1,000-person team, all the expense of running race teams.
And they're trying to share that win with their affluent owners who can buy these cars.
Correct.
So let's talk about the suspension, Mark.
All right, so everything's aluminum. There's some cast aluminum pieces. You have Brembo carbon ceramics standard on the 458. And like every carbon ceramic setup, it's about $20,000 to replace them. In terms of airflow ductwork, this is the only ductwork for the brakes that runs here, that guides here. And that's one of the strong suits of the Ferraris. The carbon ceramics tend to last a long time unless you're tracking it. If you are tracking these cars hardcore, you absolutely want to go for something like Essex makes. Essex is the AP distributor in the US. They do a steel replacement. So you can just burn through steel discs instead of spending $20,000.
We'll talk about it when we get underneath the engine, but a business we've worked with in the past, Extreme Experience, did actually track several 458s, and I spent a lot of time talking to their lead mechanic. So that'll be interesting. The other thing to talk about with their suspension, Mark, is their MagneRide dampers, and they're built by BWI, which I'm sure Chevrolet will tell you that are also on the C7 and C8 Corvettes.
And it is the same OEM.
Yes.
Okay, so it has Ferrari's individual logic for the dampers. However, this car has a front end lift, which is optional. Lifts the front end to get over curbs.
And they're built by Öhlins, correct?
The lift kit is actually Öhlins. So when you look in there, you're like, why is there an Öhlins damper? But it's not. It's just the lift portion of it. Other than that, really, there's nothing interesting or weird or exotic about this. It's a standard double wishbone suspension, in-wheel double wishbone suspension. They have cooling that runs through both wheel wells, and there's coolers in the front. You can see them both, trans, oil cooler, and there are coolant pipes that run from the front part of the car to the back. And the clamping system, the clamps that they use have been pretty solid. But like any mid-engine car where you have coolant running the length of the car, you have to inspect this stuff. These are things that could potentially leak, but this car's been pretty solid.
And there's not really any real active aero in this car. However, the little winglets in the front,
which are passive aero,
yeah,
and they are pressurized through just force of wind, and they will deflect, I believe, up to 20 millimeters.
Yeah, it's not a ton, but apparently it does make a little bit of difference. Because again, this car, at its core, is very similar to the 430 it replaced.
So let's get to the back where everything else is at, Jack.
All right.
In the back, this is where all the action is. The gearbox, engine, and suspension. But let's talk about the basics first. Suspension. The wheel pulled off over here, you can see all aluminum components, your carbon ceramics, and then your magnetic damper. But other than that, it looks like every other car. You have plastic panels that run the underbelly here with NACA ducts on both sides for kick-ups to cool the gearbox.
And this massive rear diffuser.
Massive rear diffuser, much like the front, passive aero, unlike the 488 that replaced it, which had an active flap that reduces lift and all the fun stuff. But that's why this is a more pure car, that people call it more pure, because it's still a little bit all over the place. It has that Ferrari-ness to it. It's not completely stable, fun to drive.
This is what you and I think of when we think of a Ferrari.
Correct.
This car came out when I was 14, and this car came out for you when you were
was
like
64,
75.
yeah.
But, I mean, this to me is one of my favorite cars because it is the last of the naturally aspirated, high-revving V8s that Ferrari built, and that's why it still actually holds its value pretty well.
And engine-wise, this is an evolution of a previous generation.
Yes, it's from the same engine family as the Ferrari California, but prior to this, and the Ferrari 430. And much like I talked about in the front, actually the basic architecture of this car, the aluminum subframe and all the suspension bits, are very similar to what was on that car.
So in terms of the engine, it's the same block that was in the 460.
430.
430. Okay, so same block, and they made some revisions to it because this is the first time they added direct injection, which gave them more flexibility in tuning, which allowed them also to raise the red line to 9,000 RPMs. And I think peak horsepower is around 8,700 RPMs, but this rewards you winding the piss out of it. That's where all the character is. And you combine that, they've reduced pumping losses.
And it's a dry sump.
It's a dry sump, so it winds out, it sounds so amazing.
And you pair that with a trans that has so much character. Is it the best dual clutch in the world? No.
But it doesn't need to be, because it is, so they took a Getrag unit, 7-speed dual clutch that was in the California. They put it in this car and retuned it. And the tuning is unbelievable. It's one of those, you have to drive this car to really appreciate it. And we've been in dual clutches where it's like a torque converter. They've tried to smooth every edge off of it. You don't feel any shifts.
Like what you get in the new GT500.
Yes.
It doesn't upset the car, which is objectively better.
Right.
This, you get in mid-corner, you give
like
it a shift.
bam, bam. It's like a shotgun blast every shift, and it just makes it feel so much more fun to drive. It's more like a manual transmission experience.
And it really does suit the character of this
does.
car. Sadly, they never had a manual in the 458.
And this was the contention when this came out, because it got rid of the manual transmission in the last generation car. And to me, for what this is, for the generation of car it came out in, well, it's being developed in the late probably 2000s, or mid 2000s rather. So this was the heyday of like their Formula One, like phasing out the V10s to the V8s, and that is where this spirit is. If you were a fan of Formula One in like around 2010, oh man, this is just amazing.
And Schumacher did consult on the interior of this car.
Okay.
Which is, it's why you feel like you're winning while you're driving.
No, you're not
it.
winning.
So let's get back to reality for a second. Let's talk about reliability, which is, no pun intended, the dark horse of Ferraris. This is reliable for a Ferrari, which is not saying a whole lot, because you'll probably have an engine rebuild at about 60,000 miles. I've only heard of one of these cars going about 80,000, and it was from a magazine called Evo in England. They're great, and they're my heroes because they put 80,000 miles on a 458.
But they had an engine rebuild
at
too.
60,000 miles.
And this is going to be a huge argument. The people that love these cars, that are supercar apologists, understand
You put like 5,000 miles on this car in like 10 years.
Most people,
Yeah.
when you go and look at the used market, if you find one over 20,000 miles, it's rare. And that's where we're talking about reliability. It's reliable probably up to about 35,000 miles, and then you're really rolling the dice. I don't care what you say. Anything that you wind up having to do on this car is engine out, trans out. It's
Catastrophically expensive.
So obviously, if you're already going in knowing that you have a $200,000 plus budget for a car like this, it's a non-issue, because this really is the turning point for Ferrari where things got more reliable.
Get the newest one possible.
Yes.
And don't get an 11 or a 10 like this, because they had engine fire problems, and the other thing to bring up too is the trans.
Yeah, the trans had some issues early on.
Because they didn't put any conduit around the wiring harness for the trans.
Well, some of that stuff too, and then people were just beating the shit out of it. If you go and do launch control on these things, you're going to blow a gearbox. You have to be responsible with it. It's still it's an e-diff. Yeah. So let's talk about that. The e-diff is, the magic in it is all the electronic controls, which Ferrari has now evolved over the course from this car to the 488, now the new one. The e-diff allows the car the flexibility to really transfer power where it needs to go, from the safe mode to like if you don't know anything, all the way if you want to just stuff this into a lamppost.
Yeah, you can go full off.
Yeah, it's really, the electronic part of this car was also very impressive, but we'll talk about that during the drive. Last part is, any issues you're going to have more than likely are chicken shit stuff. Electrical, weird gremlins with check engine lights, and there's some fuel system issues that affected these cars early on. But anyway, I think I'm excited to drive this, Jack. Let's get it out on the road.
All right.
Oh, Jack. Ferrari 458. What else do you need to say?
Not a whole lot, Mark.
All right. I think that's good enough.
That's pretty much what you were expecting a Ferrari to sound like.
This is exactly what I've always thought about. This is exactly what I've always thought about a Ferrari feeling and sounding like. And when I first got in the 458, it was everything that I thought it was going to be and more. And now getting a chance to drive it on the street, and granted it's a lot more cold out, tire temperatures aren't there, or will never be there, you still get what you expect and what you want out of this car, and it's the engine and transmission. So let's just shut up for a minute and listen to it. It's everything I want from a Ferrari. Do you want to hit one of those?
You want to get run over by a combine?
I don't think so. I think I'll pass on that. but what I will take, Jack, is a little bit more of what we just had. Oh, right through the rocks. Slow us down, bring us down to earth. And I think, Jack, the main thing to talk about with the Ferrari is
all the time in cars like this. What dominates the experience is the drivetrain. Really, the only reason you and I know anything about this car is the drivetrain. This V8 and this dual clutch is tremendous. It belongs in like a museum. It is pure perfection. What you want in a Ferrari is you want it to be goddamn loud, you want it to be violent on the up change and the down change, and you want to feel like you're basically in the best rock concert possible.
I literally was just transcended outside of this car. I was no longer in my human body driving it. Even in that short burst, feeling it, like you said, the sight, the sound, the connectedness that you have with this car is why people love cars. There's no other explanation. This is what gets you excited about driving, and this does not exist anymore.
This is peak Ferrari. What Ferrari is now with the twin turbo V8s, much like the McLaren 570 we drove, loses a lot of the character that makes this car. It's not how fast it gets to 100 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour. It's about the vibration and the sound.
It is. That's 100% this car. You can make a ton of arguments about how it doesn't have the best interior, shit falls apart, it's super expensive to fix, it's got a snob badge to it, all the things that you're going to want to talk about in a Ferrari that don't make it worth $300,000+.
And no one takes these things to the track anyway.
No, and if you did, hopefully you have the money to do it, but This is so amazing. If I had the money, I would buy this, and clearly I would have to completely remove all the realistic things that we think about, the practical factors of this. Man, I am so grateful to get a chance to drive this. Now, let's talk about, we've heard the engine, the transmission, of course, that's what people love about it. Let's talk about kind of like the ride quality and some of the other things. So Ferrari includes a couple things with their drive mode selector. You have wet, which just basically turns on all the nannies full. You have sport, which is kind of like the normal mode that you would drive in. Race is essentially like Sport Plus on most cars. It firms up the magnetic dampers. It has VDA, which is all your vehicle dynamics. So in race, it turns on the traction control kind of midway, the E-diff less aggressive, the stability control kind of part way. It lets you have fun without killing yourself.
And it opens up the valve and the exhaust to make it extra loud, which is also a perk, clearly.
Yes, and the way that their electronics are, so Ferrari is really good at this. Ferrari and McLaren, I would say that Ferrari does a little bit better job with all these systems, and allowing you to simply turn everything off is very easy. And on the street, I mean, you're asking for trouble with this, but you can do it. In terms of damping, it's not as good as the modern McLarens in terms of ride quality. It doesn't go as soft, but we're splitting hairs here. In bumpy ride mode that you enable it, and you can enable it in track mode, it does a really good job. And I think the main thing about this car is the interior space is so large that most people are gonna fit in here. Even if you're a little bit taller, you still have enough headroom, you don't feel claustrophobic. This is almost like
you have great visibility.
Great visibility. And I think, when you remove yourself from, okay, now we're not driving like assholes, what is it really like to be in it? And it's surprisingly normal, and I know that's the way new supercars have to be, because the people that are buying them don't want to be annihilated every time they get in here. If you're working hard and you go out on a weekend, the last thing you want to do is feel like you're suffering, and
it's not a Lotus. It does not feel like the Evora we just got out of. This is far more livable in that regard.
It's more GT car, in some aspects. So the steering, it's hyperactive. Like it's so quick to turn in, but you have no feeling. The front end
is the weakest link of this car. It's early EPS, Mark.
Yes. The kind of the last part is the stability of this car. It is very twitchy. It is very tail happy, and it's going to take some time to get used to the car's willingness to kind of walk out on you. But once you get used to it, and the fact that this car is so quick, it is a great driving tool, more so than some of the newer cars that feel like they do everything for you. There's still that element of danger in this car that you get when you drive it. You feel like you could die. You combine the fact that the dual clutch hasn't had every edge smooth off of it. When it shifts, if you shift it at the wrong time in a turn, it will snap that rear end, and that's part of the excitement of this car.
What makes it memorable is it is flawed. At its core, it's not the most refined product in pretty much every way conceivable. The 570S is probably the better car out of the supercars I've driven. However, because of the motor, because you feel something in the trans, because it is constantly walking out on you and the front end is so quick to turn in, it really does, I hate to use this term again, it gets under your skin. It's really infectious. I love this car since I was a kid, and finally getting into one, it meets every expectation.
And I think with that said, Jack, let's get into the final thoughts.
All right.
Final thoughts on the Ferrari 458. Big thanks to John, the owner, who just said, you know what, I want the best for you. And Autobahn Country Club, of course, who has helped us to navigate some tricky waters of getting fast cars out on track. Now, the pros and cons of this car. It is dominated by two things: an engine that will absolutely floor you, and the transmission is also amazing. And again, it's not about ultimate refinement. This is not the most refined pairing. In fact, the car is very unstable and tail happy. It's hard to drive fast. It's kind of rough. It's crass in many ways, and that is why you have such a connected feeling. There's better dual clutches, but as we talked about in the shop, they refine every edge out. There's smoother engines, more musical engines like the LFA, but it doesn't scream like this. This is universal, what you expect of a Ferrari machine. And a lot of this is now gone because everything is turbocharged. While they may be faster, they may be more impressive on paper, it's not any better than this. And I think if you're in love with that naturally aspirated engine, the one that just revs out, that has that sonic quality, this is a car that you must own. But there are some negatives. Paint quality is not the greatest. The interior is kind of a mixed bag of poor qualities and material choices, from the foams degrading in the dashboard and the leather shrinking, or the dashboard or certain parts delaminating, or buttons and switches that turn all tacky from melting in the sun, seats that have the bolsters that pull away, just things that you wouldn't expect or absolutely unacceptable for a car in this price range. You have electrical issues on some of these cars with lighting or interior switches. You have to weigh this. You got to do your research before you buy something like this. But overall, mechanically, this was a turning point for Ferrari. It's an amazing machine. It's been pretty reliable for a Ferrari. And if you're looking for one, I'd say if you have the cash and you know you can get a warranty on it and some maintenance plans, please buy it and bring it by so I can experience it again and again. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.